Welcome to the Communicating Capital podcast, where finance and communication get a fresh perspective. Hosted by a team of dynamic women in the industry, we're here to redefine the conversation with candid, no-nonsense interviews featuring top finance executives, communication experts, and industry leaders. With a focus on clarity and real-world impact, we make the complex world of finance digestible and relatable. So whether you're a seasoned professional or you're just interested in our world, we're here to help you navigate the space in new and exciting ways. Today, I'm joined by one of the best, Matt Hughes, Managing Director at Allele Capital Partners, a merchant bank specializing in venture capital and private equity financing for life sciences companies. Matt and the team over at Allele are deeply involved in the intersection of biotech innovation and capital markets, helping to fund and advise companies that have the potential to deliver market-changing and patient-impacting therapies. With a background spanning biotech, investment banking, and strategic advisory, Matt is someone who understands how capital flows into groundbreaking scientific discoveries. Matt, welcome to Communicating Capital.
Really happy to be here. Thank you.
Matt, you've built such an impressive career at the intersection of biotech, finance, and strategic advisory. Can you walk us through your journey and what drew you into this space, and how did you come to Allele Capital Partners?
It was all a mistake. It all just happened by accident, quite frankly. So my parents are in the financial industry. They're in wealth management. So I guess that primed me for finance. And I always knew I wanted to go into business in some capacity. Finance also kind of struck my interest. In undergrad, I studied business. And then actually a couple years in, I added a math major. I just was drawn to it. I enjoyed it more than I expected that I would. And so when I graduated and kind of joined the workforce, I naturally followed my parents' footsteps and got into wealth management, actually. And I was more in a marketing role at a wealth management firm, and it was okay, but it didn't light me on fire. It didn't, really get me excited and passionate. And so I ended up bouncing around a little bit. I went to a hedge fund at one point. It was a quantitative hedge fund, and I was doing more operations, capital introduction. And that was a rocky journey because they were a startup hedge fund, and that comes with a lot of pressures. And but I learned a lot. It was a really immersive experience. And then I jumped over to an investment bank and a small boutique investment bank in South Florida. I joined their institutional sales team. And that was a perfect marriage for, I think, my skill set and my interests. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you're in investment banking. So there's a lot of exciting companies you learn about, and you need to know the details, right? Especially if you're in institutional sales, you're speaking to sophisticated investors. So if you're trying to sell your research and bring in road shows, if you're trying to establish real relationships, you need to build trust. And in order to build trust, you need to demonstrate some capacity of understanding of the product. Mm-hmm. And on the investment banking side, in institutional sales, the product is the research. So how well can you understand the needs of the institutional client and what research and ideas would fit their process, their criteria, et cetera? So that scratched my analytical, itch, if you will, right? I studied math. I loved that. I loved digging into complex companies and ideas. So that was fun, but I also enjoyed the relationship aspect of working with people and talking to people and daily having to interact with people. Mm-hmm. And so when I was at this investment bank, I think I found a really nice role that kind of covered all the things that I'm interested in. That bank covered a lot of sectors: energy, TMT, consumer, and life sciences. And over time, the life sciences, niche of that bank kind of consumed me. One, because there were more opportunities in there. There's more deal flow. And so naturally, you're going to be drawn to the areas where there's more opportunity. Mm-hmm. But it just was really interesting because you can jump into science, and it was really rich from a subject matter standpoint. And I just kept running with it. And so when I joined Allele was really an upstart at the time, but founded by a couple of guys that had a ton of experience, really knowledgeable. I respected them a lot. And they were looking to continue building and growing. And there was a nice opportunity for me to join and to help do that. And so I took the risk. I jumped over, and it's been really a fulfilling journey and a fun journey. And that's the story.
I love that so much. I love that it wasn't expected. And now here you are, and you're advising some of the most incredible companies that are working on such groundbreaking science. And I do know, and for our audience that's listening in, Allele Capital does specialize in early stage life sciences investing. So companies that are going through different clinical trials, or let's say they just got a drug approved, what do you do next? Maybe they're going off for pharmaceutical partners or something of the sort. Of course, Matt can speak on that a lot better than I can. But I feel like you're looking at companies long before they become household names. What makes a biotech company truly investable would be perhaps the potential or something. Can you talk a little bit about that? About what do you think a biotech company needs to do, and how do you evaluate which ideas that have the most commercial potential?
Totally. Okay. So that's a great question. There's a couple of questions in there, though. So, because how do you evaluate the commercial prospects, but also the investability? Those aren't always, sometimes those are at odds, and I'll explain. And I think there's a big debate right now in the biotech community, the biotech capital markets community in particular, given that biotech has performed really badly, right, for the last many years, which is frustrating. And you could argue, do any of us know what is investable and what is successful from an investment standpoint, not necessarily a commercial standpoint, because again, those aren't always one-to-one. So from the investability standpoint, the way I look at it right now is among the highest risks for biotech is the financing risk. And companies are always so quick to jump into, well, here's our mechanism, here's why it's really well understood, or here's the next clinical study we have to do, here's why we think it'll work. And they focus on the scientific or the technical risk, and that's important. Or they'll talk about the commercial risk. So they'll talk about those types of risk buckets, but the financing risk is a really heavy weight because, of course, it's a long journey until you're not even just commercial, but break even, right? Even if you become commercial, you get your product approved and you're generating revenue, you still likely have a long journey to actually being break even, which means the capital requirements are so intensive and they cover a long period of time. So the financing risk is really important. So when I look at what ideas, what companies are investable, the financing risk element is what I really look at pretty closely. And the way that we try to understand what that risk is to look at the milestones, the roadmap of milestones, to understand how much capital is required to unlock each milestone and to understand what needs to be done to finance through those milestones. Mm-hmm. And so that's really important. From a commercial risk standpoint, so if I jump over to the other dynamic of how do we assess the commercial viability of a product, it really comes down to you have what's on paper of what's in the deck, what's the need that is being sought to treat or address in some capacity. But we really just want to learn what it really is. When you're dealing with a 5 to 10 year development time horizon and you're trying to assess and understand what a commercial prospect is 5-10 years down the road, a lot can change. There's a lot of opinion baked into what that commercial opportunity is. So what do the KOLs say? What do patients say? What would payers say? You need to get a lot of opinions, and the company's opinion is important, but of course there's a lot of bias in there. So what does the broader community think? And really the patients or the people that are going to pay for the treatment, we have to look at all of those aspects to try to get good fidelity on what we think the commercial prospects are. So it's really trying to look at it from as many angles as possible.
Incredible answer. Absolutely incredible. I feel like you just hit it out of the park. And it's actually something, Matt, you recently said that we're in this wave of innovation within biotechnology. I don't know if you said that during your fun 5-minute biotech drills, which I think everybody should listen into on LinkedIn. But what are the most exciting trends that you're seeing right now? And where do you think the next big breakthroughs in biotech will come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about this. And I think a lot of people are in reflection mode right now in the biotech arena, just given how tough the markets have been. And where my mind takes me is so much innovation has been directed towards trying to treat diseases, and you're making incremental progress. And I think there's a lot of debate about how much value there is in incremental improvements on disease. And I think over time, where we have to get to is more on the prevention side. I think there's a lot of questions in that, like the business models. And, we know what a business model is for a drug. And so you can think that you can kind of handicap what the, valuation should be on a certain or the, NPV should be on a certain project or asset. And the business models are a little more established. On the prevention side, it more may need to be baked in order to have a good understanding of what the different business models are. But I think that the need is there to really help intervene in disease well before it happens. But we're in an aging society, right? So chronic disease, there's a lot of people with disease already. So of course that has to be addressed. But I think over maybe the long term, prevention is going to be very important. And there's a lot of, we're going to have to see how that plays out. There's going to be a lot of trial and error and hit or miss in that. But I think that's where we have to go.
I think that's a really good trend to talk about is prevention, and especially as everybody seems to be aging, at least the population is in general. So something I am going to pivot a little bit because a part of your work goes way beyond investing. I know that you advise your clients, whether it be on communication strategies with investors or how to perhaps attract the right type of investor into a deal. So many early stage biotech founders are brilliant scientists, but they're not necessarily capital markets experts. And I'd like to know how you guide them through the fundraising and the strategic growth process.
You're right. A lot of our we come across a lot of people that are very smart in their domains. And capital markets is another animal. And some founders and corporate executives, it comes easy. Others need a little bit more help, right? And that's where we tend to come in. And so I would say a couple of things. Number one, we find that founders can get caught in the trap of like being so focused on their drug, their problem, but you have to do a temperature check with the market to understand how is the market valuing the need in that area. And I think it's helpful to really get an understanding of where the current markets are in terms of what types of approaches are being valued and how. Not to say that necessarily you should change course because the markets can be wrong, right? So I'm not saying that you have to live and die by the market, but it's helpful to have that information because maybe you should change something. And so it's important to have that type of, insight. And then what we find with a lot of founders and corporate executives is when you're going through a fundraising process, for instance, that's what we help a lot of them on. It's really important to develop the relationships with investors and to really understand what they need, to kind of start a call and start an interaction and start a relationship that might lead with them funding you or not, but to understand what their needs are, what they're looking for. We get a lot of companies that jump on with investors or strategic partners and just jump right into, here's what we're doing, here's what we need. And they don't necessarily naturally want to take the time to check in with the other party to understand, well, what's your strategy? And is there overlap here? Is there a match here? And having kind of a shared understanding is really important. So those types of elements are the things that we help our companies with.
I love that. And if you were to say there's one thing that a founder needs to understand about navigating the capital markets successfully, what would you say that is?
So the capital markets, if you're thinking about you're going out to raise capital, I would say a couple of things. Number one, when you're bringing on investment dollars, it goes back to what I was sharing in the last answer, which is you have to understand the needs of the other party. And so when you're designing the strategic path for the company, it goes back to a couple of things that I've already mentioned, which is you need to be very clear on financing risk going forward and how you're going to manage that. If you don't properly manage that, financing risk can be a very heavy weight on a company. And investors, again, this goes back to understanding what's motivating them and what their needs are. They want to see the company progress well fundamentally. So they want to see the science develop, you hit your milestones. But if you're successful fundamentally, but you haven't properly planned for the financing, future financing requirements and managing financing risk, and you're executing well fundamentally, but the stock isn't reflecting that. And I'm not saying we don't have perfect control over what the stock does. So I'm not saying that, but you have to at least plan for those future financing events so that you can try to match as best as possible fundamental progress with additional capital raising capability. That's really important. So that's number one. Number two, I say to company founders and executives all the time that when you're going out on a financing process, it is a sales process. And you have to be constantly in front of investors, learning what's on their mind, learning what market sentiment is, having a two-way conversation. But you have to be constantly in front of folks. And you also have to constantly educate the market on what you're doing. Because in small cap, micro cap, universe, so regardless of sector, but in life sciences, particularly, what your company is doing isn't just ubiquitously known across the capital markets. So it's up to you to actively educate the market on what you're doing so that you can get credit where it's due. So I would say those two things, which is constantly having in your mind how you're going to manage future financing requirements. And number two, constantly educating the market in a real way, so not in a hugely promotional way or whatever, but with substance, what you're doing, why it's important, so that investors, there's kind of a symmetry of information where what the market knows, so that you can get, your due credit.
I love that. And from my experience of working with you and others that are at Allele, I feel like there's so much more that y'all do. You wear so many different hats. And by doing so, you truly provide that special touch of value to your clients. How does that multi-pronged approach benefit your clients? And how does it make you a little bit different than other biotech-focused investment groups?
I love that question because you're playing into what I think is one of our strengths.
Love it.
So I love that question because you're right. At Allele, we're doing a number of things.
Right.
We started initially as purely a merchant bank where we would build our own companies, finance those companies with our own capital, and get those companies public. We've done a bunch of those across our careers. We've done a number of them under the Allele umbrella, and 3 of our companies we've taken public in the last few years. And where we're also investing our own money, and I'm wiring into our companies, so you have skin in the game. At our core, at our DNA, and what was the very start and the starting pillar of Allele was building companies and investing our own time, energy, and capital into those companies. So when you do that, you're forced to learn, you're forced to learn a lot of lessons, and you're forced to make decisions that have real weight, for you. When you're purely just advising and there's not as much at stake, you sometimes don't have to think as much about the questions. And I can, think about the times where we were making decisions for our own companies and just how deeply you have to think about strategic decisions because you know how much is at stake. And you personally, and for me, I personally have had a lot at stake. So that has grounded us in a way that, at my prior firm, they were doing that, but I wasn't really involved on the merchant side. So I can see the difference between when I was at another firm and I wasn't personally involved and to now at Allele where I am. And so we take that knowledge, that skill set and apply it to our client companies and help them with a number of things, whether it be corporate strategy, financings, getting their message out to different investors. There's a whole array of things that we look to do to help them solve their capital markets challenges. But that's coming from a place of what we've had to learn for our own companies. So it's been fun.
Love it. And I like that you're talking about different investors because I know that you work closely with institutional investors, accredited investors, retail investors, corporate partners, you name it. You all are working on that. I know that your Rolodex is quite long when it comes to those that might be interested in the companies that you're working on at the moment. How do you match the right investors with the right biotech companies? And what do those investors really look for when they're looking at a company such as the ones that are your clients?
I like to think of it as having a two-pronged strategy of we want push and pull.
Okay.
So on the push side, we look at companies, comparable companies or comparable transactions, and we try our best to map out the applicable universe. And it's a process that every banker, every IR firm, everyone's going to do because it's the natural thing of I have a company A and they do these 3 things and this other company does those 3 things too. And who's been attracted to invest in them. So that's a natural process that anyone goes through. And we do that too. But what we're also big fans of is having a pull method. which is how can you attract in investors where we're not chasing them down per se, but they are aware of what the company is doing. And through a self-selection process, they're reaching out to learn more because they're aware of what the company is doing and are interested, and it aligns with their interests. And so we like having both approaches of we're going to chase down folks we think are a good fit based on the fundamentals of the company and, the profile of that investor. But what we also want to do is to help create a presence for our clients where we're attracting in strategic partners and other types of investors, institutional on down, because, they've seen something the company put out and we're attracted to it.
I'm going to go ahead and circle back to the major theme in biotech, which is private to public transitions, which I know that you've had so much experience on. I mean, you just mentioned that companies scaling from venture funding to IPOs. What does that process look like? And what should biotech founders know before taking their companies public?
A lot of the responses to that are in some of the things I covered, which is you have to know the market. And so if you know the market and the public markets, you can better assess where you stand in relation to that. And that'll be important because you can also gut check what you might be hearing from banks and other folks. And so it's really important to have an understanding of what's happening in the markets and where you may potentially fit. What's also important are having good advisors. And it's self-serving, but, let's say it wasn't Allele, but other people. You want good people in place, people on the PR side, you want your full stack of advisors, and also the right bank. You want the right banking partners that understand how to build the right book of investors to come into that transaction. So I would say have some market knowledge and awareness of where you stand in relation to what's happening in the market. Two, have your set of advisors that can properly advise you when is the right time and what is the right construction of an investor book, et cetera, because it may not be the right time. And you need an honest opinion of when is the right time and when to pull that trigger. And then I would say I would again go back to thinking about the milestones and try to pressure test the milestones as best you can. So when you're thinking about your IPO story and what is going to be sold to public investors, and those public investors are going to be looking very closely at what are your milestones. And we know that right now in the public markets, investors want everything. They want big milestones really quickly and for not a lot of capital.
Right.
and you might say, well, they just want everything, and their response might be, well, it's been a tough few years, right? That that's what investors need right now, and I get it. That's what's required in order for something to be investable. A concept we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. So if you're considering taking your company public, I would think about what are those milestones you have in the first year, and as you evaluate what the potential value is, if you hit that milestone, I would pressure test that significantly to figure out, is that real? Mm-hmm. Is that real value? We can all model something. We can all create a DCF and estimate some value, right. But there's a lot of negative EV, negative enterprise companies right now that have DCF models showing huge valuations. So you have to be real when you're looking at how the market might value your milestones. And so I would just try to be as honest as possible when you're looking at those before going down that road that requires a lot of commitment.
I feel that if I was a biotech founder and I was bringing a company from point A to point B and potentially going public, I'd want you on my team. I'd want you in my pocket in 2 seconds, because you're right. And you do have to do a market check, because I might think I have the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm like, look, I'm going to save XYZ or perhaps help certain patients with something that is actually life-threatening or something that might be personal to me. You do need people like you to look at that and look at the big picture and be able to tell you what's real and what's not. Speaking of something, we've actually talked about relationship building on this podcast with every single guest, and they've talked about how important that is. And I know that your network is quite strong. You have executives, investors, thought leaders, and a lot of them are not only in biotech, but all over in capital markets. Can you tell us what advice you might have for founders that are looking to expand their network?
I think this might go down. It might just come down to classic relationship building and, go into even some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, which is understanding what the other person needs and wants, so it has to be a two-way street, and having a good understanding of what their goal might be just really helps, build that relationship. And so you might say, okay, fine, I'll do that, but how do I get connected? And I would just say that going out to events and being out in the industry and out in the world is a great way to start, building those contacts. And from, it's kind of this journey of from contact to relationship to trusted partner, right? There's that kind of evolution of relationships. So sure, you have to first have the contact in order to build the relationship. So I would say, industry events, being out in the industry, and social media is obviously also a great way to make those contacts. So between industry events and social media, those are great ways to form a connection. But then to take it from connection to trusted partner and, through the stage of relationship building, that takes kind of really understanding the other person and figuring out, where there's overlap and where you can really exchange.
You're deeply embedded in the biotech investment ecosystem. If you can give one piece of advice to biotech entrepreneurs that are either looking to secure funding or scale their business or perhaps go from private to IPO, what would it be?
As a company founder, I'm trying to think about this really carefully and going to try to add something, if there's anything I haven't covered already. Because I've covered a lot of things, like even the last question of kind of finding new contacts, building relationships. We've talked about understanding milestones and kind of getting the right advisors in place that can give you good information and connect you with others. I would say, something I haven't covered yet necessarily is really understanding the problem you're trying to solve and really understanding what solution would be valuable. I mean, there's a lot of drugs that even get approved through the FDA that commercially they don't work, right? And there's a lot of dynamics to what the market really is ready to absorb. And so even if you hit that threshold of we got a drug approved, it doesn't necessarily mean that getting through your clinical trials is what kind of will win the marketplace and win the commercial. So I would say if you're looking ahead at, you're trying to solve a big problem, which means you hope a lot of people adopt your solution, I would just be really clear on all the other dynamics that drive commercial success or commercial failure. And it has to do with what the end user really wants. It has to do with the economic models. Is there an economic model that will build, a kind of good ecosystem around your product where people want to adopt it? And then, who's going to pay for it? And so understanding all of those dynamics is really important.
So Matt, I do want to flip it from, everything that you do to actually be all about Matt. So if somebody's listening in and they're like, look, I want to do what he's doing, or I'm interested. I know you said that you got here by accident, right? But it's never true. It might not be by accident for somebody else. So what advice would you give them if they want to break in and do exactly what you're doing?
It's funny. I remember when I was at my first job out of college, it was at this wealth management company where I was in the marketing, on the marketing team. And I remember we were doing this dinner event for clients, and we had an outside fund come in and they were promoting their product and promoting their, kind of portfolio of funds. And they wanted us to adopt those, on behalf of our clients. And I remember there was this person that came in to really sell the merits of their fund. And I remember just so impressed with what they were doing. I thought that is what I want to do. Because again, it comes back to what I was earlier talking about, where this blend of this woman had really good technical knowledge of what they were doing. And I really respected that. But she was also out and about and talking to people. I thought, man, that is where I need to go. And it's so funny because you're right. I said that I got here by accident, but I actually got to where I did want to go, but it came through these steps that I didn't have the foresight to see. How is it going to get me there? But it did. So whatever forces made that happen, I'm thankful to that. So what advice would I give to someone? What I think helped me in my climb and in my journey was putting a lot of work into really trying to understand as best I could. For instance, when I was at the last bank and just getting my start in the investment banking world, I would spend a lot of time studying and trying to understand our companies. And I just spent a lot of time because, again, building trust with the company executives or building trust with the investors would depend on, do I know what I'm talking about?
Right.
And the answer still is like, I have this joke. And funny enough, even after the fact, so I said I studied math and business undergrad. I did go back and get my master's in biotechnology.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. And I did that a couple of years after starting that investment banking job on the institutional sales team. So I did go back and try to fill in some of those education gaps. And one stupid little joke that I put out sometimes with companies when I'm just meeting them is, I said, well, I did my master's in biotechnology, so I half know what I'm talking about. Because, we're always talking to PhDs, MDs.
Yeah, people that have been doing it for 45 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're right. And so I'll say as like a joke, like, I'm not a PhD. And maybe I should say like a quarter know what I'm talking about.
Oh, half you do know what you're talking about. You know quite a lot, Matt. You know quite a lot.
Yeah, I'm getting there. But I think if I were giving advice, right, the question was, what advice would I give? If I was giving advice to someone earlier in their career and maybe what I'm doing sounds interesting to them or kind of this world sounds interesting to them, to me, I think people people admire and respect knowledge. People admire and respect technical understanding. So that's number one. But number two is, can you communicate? Can you communicate, the level to which you understand these things? And can you make, connections? So I would say those two things are important. They were important to me, is building a good technical base of knowledge and then being able to communicate that and build good exchange amongst peers.
I love it. I feel like this was such a good conversation. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you, Jessica.
So happy to have you. And for our listeners that want to learn more about Allele Capital Partners and also connect with Matt, be sure to check out the links in our show notes. As always, thank you for joining Communicating Capital.